Hello, everyone, and welcome to Growing Together, a gardening podcast with me, John Lamb, and Don Kinsler, a lifelong gardener and the North Dakota State University Extension horticulturist for Cass County. Today's show is sponsored by Heirloom Roses. Visit them online at heirloomroses.com. Don, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, and I'm especially excited to talk about our topics today. Because have you driven around town and noticed how beautiful, like the peonies and iris in people's yards are?
Don, I don't have to. I can walk out in my backyard and I can take it all in. We were on vacation. We were gone last weekend, and we were really hoping that the peonies were just about to bloom, and we were so hoping that we wouldn't miss it because, in some years they will bloom, and then if you get a rain or you get wind, it can just knock all the petals off and you don't get it. We came back to a wonderfully showy peony, nice yellow irises, some blue bearded irises up in front. It's been really, really great. It's been a great year for the garden.
It really has. In our flower beds, likewise, the peonies and iris are just beautiful. They've really enjoyed the cool weather. Mm-hmm. We had a day of 90 degrees or so, but I'm glad we have not had just entire weeks of 90 degrees and hot winds, because the cool temperatures that we've had this spring and the moisture have really brought out the buds, and it's just amazing, the iris and the peonies, and just to watch them. And so, like you, I take a walk around our yard in the evenings when it's nice and pleasant and just soak it all in. Now, when you mentioned you were hoping that you weren't going to miss the peonies blooming, and occasionally, I hear people, and I suppose I think about this too, wouldn't it be nice if they just would bloom longer?
Right.
But, comes to mind the old adage, familiarity breeds contempt. I can't imagine myself getting tired of seeing peonies blooming all summer, but to kind of make me feel a little better, I think, well, if they were blooming like that all summer, maybe I wouldn't appreciate them as well. So I guess I maybe appreciate our peonies and iris more because they are so beautiful, and I know there's going to come a time that they're not blooming, and so I guess I really appreciate them more now than if they were blooming all the time.
So let's start off. Let's talk about peonies. Like, how do you get a good, successful peony? Like, what are the steps you need to go through? Because, like we're talking about now, peonies, you can't really plant a peony now and expect to see much this year. You're going to get some nice green leaves and some nice green foliage, but really, you're going to need to plant, 1 or 2 years before you really start seeing some flowers?
And that's one thing I really enjoy about peonies, is because it teaches us patience. Good things come to those who wait. I love some of those old sayings. But, peonies, yes, when you plant a peony, the first year, it's not going to do much. Like you say, you're going to get leaves. And if it does produce a bud, it's actually best to cut that off the first year. Then the second year, when it grows, you're going to get the leaves, maybe a couple of buds. It's best to cut those off because we're in it for the long game here, the long term. And so a peony, the first year you plant it, second year, the third year, it finally is going to start establishing itself. But the good news is, rewarding your patience, is that it's going to be in place maybe for 100 years. And that's one thing I love about peonies, is that many of the early homesteaders, in addition to the iris that we're going to talk about, many of the early homesteaders, some of the first flowers that they planted would be things like peonies, because they're just so solid, and once you get them established, they are there. In fact, I know there are people that have homesteads, homesteaded by their grandparents, great-grandparents, and those peonies are still there. And in fact, I think I wrote an article about that a few years ago and asked people to write in. And there was one homestead, and the farmyard was still occupied, so it had been cared for, but I believe that peony had been planted in the 1880s, and so remarkably long-lived. So, what's a couple of years when it's going to last 100 years?
I've got a story. I may have told this to you before. I may have even said this on the air before, told this to listeners during the podcast. But we moved into our house 7 years ago, and on the back of the house, it was a nice area, but there was some things there that we didn't like, including a huge mint patch. And mint, of course, will just spread crazy. It'll grow thick, so if you want it,
little mint goes a long way.
Oh, mint goes a long way. And so it was maybe good for the previous owners, but we just didn't. We wanted to do other things with that space, so we covered it up with a black tarp. With a lawn.
Yeah, the smothering technique. I like it.
Yep. And left that on for, I think, a year or 2 years, right?
Yeah.
And I noticed one over the course of some time, there was this lump that was coming up. And I thought, what kind of a volunteer, because I thought it was like a volunteer tree root or the elm or something like that. Something's coming up, but it's coming up, at a good speed. So I cut it open and out pops what I realized later was a peony.
Oh, really?
That we had, I don't remember a peony in there and seeing it in there. And I think maybe
You released it from jail.
We did.
Was the mint, do you suppose, suppressing it totally?
I don't know if it was that or because we moved in. Or you just
maybe didn't know that peony was there.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it was because we didn't know it was there. We didn't know it moved in. But, so this is the picture that I took. I'm showing a picture to Don today. This is what it looked like this morning.
Oh,
this is
so that's the peony that you that you unleashed from that was trying to poke through the smothering,
that was kind of coming up.
Wow.
And now it's a full-size bush. It'll probably, and we didn't do the cutting off of the buds. We didn't know about that. Probably should have.
Sure, but that had been in place for a while.
It must have been in place. And I think because we moved in early spring, maybe we didn't see it growing and we decided to cover up the mint then before it really took off. But very happy to have it now. And who knows how long it's been there. It's a great,
beautiful. I should maybe explain too, when I mentioned removing the buds on those peonies, and I should mention the why. So when a person plants a new young peony and it tries to send up a bud, that bud can take a lot of energy from that plant, and it's really too young to be producing that big of a blossom, and it stresses the plant. So removing the bud the first year and the second year, removing those buds, it allows all the energy to go into the root system and develop a bigger, huskier plant sooner than letting it waste energy on those first few blossoms.
So I think, because we're talking here in the second week of June that really a lot of peonies, if they haven't bloomed yet, they will soon bloom. What do we do after the blooms?
Well, after the blooms are done, when they start shedding and dropping all their petals, fairly soon after that, we should deadhead them, remove those, because after the petals drop, then they start forming a seed pod. Have you ever left them on and kind of noticed that seed pod starting to form?
No.
And, not all the flowers will result in a seed pod, but they can start to go to seed, and that's an energy sap for those peonies. And so it's better just to cut them off. Another nice thing I like about peonies, since we mentioned what to do after they're kind of done blooming like that. Okay, deadhead, cut off those so they don't form seed pod. But it's interesting how that peony itself, even when it's not blooming, the peony, it's almost like a shrub. They're pretty dark green.
It's a great, really sturdy green leaves, almost kind of waxy in a way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And
really nice.
So it's quite a nice feature in the landscape or the perennial flower garden, even when they're not in bloom. When you mentioned what to do after the flowers are done fading, it brings to mind also one step before that. Some of the older varieties of peonies have the habit of flopping apart. Yeah. These massive big blossoms, and then they'll weight down the branches and then just being laying closer to the ground than upright. And so I think in past podcasts, I believe you had you found a kind of a peony cage? Now, there are kind of specific ones for peonies that are put on in early spring just as the growth is starting to come out of the ground. They're kind of a mesh of wires, how would you describe that? Kind of a...
It's a circle with a grid. So it's almost like a grill grate, except for it's both ways across. So it's a grid more than a grate. And the squares are, depending, I've seen smaller ones and bigger ones, but I think you can get squares maybe up to 3 to 4 inches.
Sure. So the emerging peony, the shoots grow up through that, and then this grid supports them so that they don't all fall apart. If a person doesn't find that, you can with twine or, maybe a circle of hardware cloth or something. But sometimes those become a little visible.
Yeah.
So that peony grid, that's definitely the way to go. And I've seen those online and in garden supply catalogs. So they are available. And of course, once you have those, then you're going to have them. One thing about some of the newer varieties of peonies, in a minute we'll talk about buying and starting a new peony plant. But one of the things about the newer varieties, one of the things that they've bred peonies especially for is stronger stalks, because none of us want those to be flopping apart because they're so pretty.
Kind of like a hydrangea in a way.
Yes,
that's one of the features that they've done when breeding
is strong stems, so that the peonies will stand more upright. So if you're kind of looking at peonies, maybe in other people's yards, and you notice that they aren't all flopping apart, they may be some of the newer varieties with those stronger stems. And so, good things are happening for peonies. The breeders have definitely been looking for that. So anyway, the one other thing that is kind of neat as we're talking about peonies, have you ever heard the old tale that you need ants on a peony bud? And of course, I never refer to them as old wives' tales because because some of the best gardeners I've ever known have been old wives. They're wonderful. And so anyway, the old tale about needing that the buds won't open unless you have ants. Well, that was easy research to do. Just grow peonies in a closed environment like a greenhouse, in which you're sure that you're excluding all ants, and see, do they open? And yes, they do. So the ants are just looking for a good meal on the nice sticky peony buds. And so because they come in close association with each other, then sometimes think, oh, well, they must be needed. But actually, the ants are not needed. But the ants do indicate good, healthy buds, because good, healthy buds have that stickiness to them, and they're probably large. And so ants plus good peonies oftentimes go hand in hand together.
As your peony is growing, as the buds are starting to form, is there anything I've heard that you should look for, kind of like shoots coming off of that main shoot that maybe you'd want to trim off again to focus the energy on that shoot, that if there's a side bud or something like that?
Right, because sometimes the flowers will kind of have one main big flower or bud, and then there will be those kind of slightly smaller buds. Now, you've hit upon the key for those that are going to show a peony flower, like in a flower show or at the fair, exhibiting flowers at a fair or a flower show. What they do is they remove those secondary buds, the smaller buds, so that all the impact, all the energy goes into that one main central flower, and then it'll be bigger and better.
Okay.
And even better shape. That brings up to mind, too. Have you ever brought peonies in? Because some of the varieties smell so good.
We brought one in the other day. And so
in a bouquet?
Just one in. So we just put it in a small little vase. I really haven't gone up to really smell it, but it hasn't been, I've been sitting by it.
Oh, sure.
And now that I think about it,
they will vary. They do vary in fragrance a little bit. But one of the common things is for people that do bring in a nice bouquet of peonies, and all of a sudden you got ants crawling all over the table.
Okay.
But the flower people that exhibit flowers, have a cure for that. Because, of course, if you bring a peony to a flower show and the judge is coming along and there's ants crawling all over everything, well, that's not the best. So here's what the flower people do so that aren't bringing ants in. Okay, you cut the peony flower, and then have a bucket of water, and then tip the flower upside down and immerse it down in the water. It doesn't hurt the peony at all, and the ants will float off.
Okay.
And then you just shake the excess water off, and no more ants.
If you're going to make a bouquet out of peonies, are you better off waiting until the flowers come, or cutting and bring them in as as when they're about to bloom?
When they're about to bloom or half open, they'll
Okay.
continue to open. And but if a person pauses too long and it's close to shedding petals, then it doesn't last long, and pretty soon you've got petals all over the coffee table. So yeah, when it's well opened, maybe half opened, and then it'll continue to open the rest of the way. So it is fun to enjoy some of those indoors as a bouquet.
Well, and talking about the kind of dunking the flower petals in water. We've talked about this before, but the peonies are really susceptible to is it a mildew? And so when you've still got them outside, when you've got your plant outside, you really want to be careful how you water it, right?
You do, because now we mentioned how a peony plant, even when it's not blossoming, can be a very nice, almost a shrub-like accent in the perennial flower garden. We mentioned the leaves, nice dark green, but if it develops the mildew, which is called powdery mildew, when a peony develops that, the leaves become coated with this whitish gray material, and it just looks unattractive. I suppose if they're pure silver, I suppose some people might think maybe that's attractive in a way, but no, it kind of makes the peony look very unattractive. And once that gray powdery mildew starts, it's a fungus disease, and once it starts, there's no reversing it for that growing season. It doesn't wash off. You can't wipe it off. It's that embedded into the leaf tissue. And so prevention is the way to go. Now, you mentioned watering. When a person is watering a peony, very important to water only the soil around and not get any splashed up on the leaves, because the fungus that causes the powdery mildew disease loves water, splashing water, moisture, things like that. And so to water early enough in the day so that the foliage, if it does get any water on, it will dry before nightfall, and also just to keep the water only on the soil itself. And if, despite your best efforts, you still are bothered with powdery mildew each year, you might try applying a fungicide. Fungicides are generally preventative. You need to put it on before the problem starts or at the very earliest sign. There are many good flower fungicides. Sometimes the products are just simply called flower and vegetable fungicide. These same fungicides that protect like tomato blight will often protect also flowers. So you just check the label, make sure peonies are on it, and apply that. They're easy to apply. You can even mix some up in a watering can and just water it over the leaves like that. But important that it be applied when the leaves are still healthy and green as a preventative. The other thing, as long as we're talking about the blight, good sanitation. So in the fall of the year, when the peony has been frosted and the leaves are all just hanging limp, that's the perfect time to cut that peony back just a little above soil level, maybe an inch or so, and then throw those leaves in the trash. Just good sanitation. Whether or not your peony did have the powdery mildew, just get rid of that.
So you don't want to compost them just to eliminate
right.
that
Peonies
chance.
are one thing that because they are so prone to disease and it can make them look so ragged, it's better just to dispose of that foliage.
And so anything else that we should do is kind of as far as like the fall cleanup, or like after we have the flower, after we have the wonderful green leaves, keep those up. And once it frosts, cut them down. Anything else we should do over winter?
Yeah. In fact, the fall of the year, about that time that the peonies are going to be frosted, or maybe even a little earlier, the traditional time to dig and divide a peony is in September, around Labor Day. So we may or may not have had frost about that time, but that is the time. Around Labor Day in September is the time to dig and divide a peony. Well, how do you know if your peony needs divided? They can stay in place 100 years. But if ever your peony starts to become dead in the middle, where all the good material is on the outer perimeter and the center has become dead and no longer has shoots, then that's the time to dig and divide. And so a big old peony clump, you can maybe get, 6 or 8 good clumps. Now, it's interesting. When you dig up a peony, you'll find these big kind of massive roots. They're not really fibrous, but there will be a few of those. But they're these big kind of thick roots. And when you do dig and divide a peony, you'll find these buds. They're either whitish, pinkish white, down in these big massive roots. They're called the eyes of a peony. And it's very important that each of the divisions that you have, so if you split up this big chunk with a knife or a shovel or a saw, it's important that you have at least maybe 3 or so of those buds in there. If you don't have enough of those, it's not going to kind of regenerate itself fast enough. So that's the why you dig and divide. I suppose you could a good healthy one, if neighbor wants, or if it's great grandmother's peony and all the great grandchildren would like a clump of that. Which isn't that a neat heirloom? To have. I've got grandma's peony. I've got grandma's rhubarb, but I don't have her I don't have her peony. But anyway, so that would be the time to do that, to dig and divide, and and of course, I should mention planting depth on peonies. With a lot of perennials that we plant, maybe, excuse me, maybe they're potted. The planting depth, you plant them maybe a little deeper than what's in the pot, but peonies are more exacting. When you dig, divide, you'll see these eyes, those kind of whitish, pinkish eyes down in the roots. And it's very important that that uppermost eye or bud is only about an inch or no more than 2 inches below soil surface. If peonies are planted too deep, they'll grow, but they don't like to bloom. And so the planting depth is really important, kind of fussy. So locate that uppermost bud and make sure that's only about an inch and a half below soil surface.
Talking about dividing peonies and replanting, maybe moving some peonies around, do you follow the same thing with a new peony, like you were saying, that the first 2 years cut off the buds before they flower to preserve that energy and focus that energy into the long-term growth of the plant? Should you do that when you divide a peony too?
Yes, same case. Since you're kind of disrupting its whole root system, and it's got to kind of regenerate more roots and get established again. So yeah, the same thing with digging and dividing. Those first 2 years should keep any blossoms that it tries to produce out. It's interesting. I think we've talked before about one of the best innovations in the whole garden center thing was the invention of the plastic nursery pot.
Yes.
Because that allowed garden centers to have product on their shelf in a plastic nursery pot all summer long. So even though September, Labor Day, is the traditional time to dig and divide and replant peonies, because garden centers have peonies in plastic pots, we can plant them all year long. Starting in spring, June here, we could be planting peonies. So it's perfectly fine to plant a peony. The sooner in the growing season you plant it, the more established it can be. If it's currently has some weak blossoms on it, it's kind of fun to see what it would be. But I definitely cut those off. And so, potted peonies, you'll find at garden centers now. Yes, and definitely go ahead and get them planted. You don't have to wait for September to plant a potted peony.
Well, it's kind of great to know, because then to know that it's flexible like that if you've been rearranging your garden all summer long, then you see, that's the one thing. When you see your garden and you see it in its full glory, then you notice, this is what I want to do different. That maybe that's something that you can do. You could still plug in a peony and know that in 2 years, in that spot, you're going to get some really nice flowers.
Exactly.
All right, this is great. Let's take a quick little break. When we come back, we're going to talk about irises.
When you can't make it to City Hall or school board meetings, local journalists from Inforum.com will be there to report the facts and get your questions answered. Local news works for you. Stay up to date at Inforum.com.
All right, we're back and we just got done talking about peonies, and now we're going to kind of turn our attention to irises. And irises, I would say, not everybody has some, but you certainly see them when people do have them. They are a very showy showy, colorful flower. And even when they aren't, they have a wonderful leaf structure. They do seem kind of almost, they're not like daylilies in that they're not everywhere. They're not ubiquitous, but they are really fairly common. And I wonder if that's because there's so many different varieties of irises.
I think you're right. And it's so logical to talk about iris and peonies together, because not only do they bloom kind of close to each other, in most cases, they're kind of blooming about the same time, give or take a few days. But the other thing that makes them so similar is that they're such good, rugged perennials. We mentioned the homesteaders planted peonies. Iris weren't far behind. Usually on a lot of these farmsteads, you saw iris also. And I like to think of these two, iris and peonies, as a couple of the good backbone perennials for a perennial garden. Of course, a person would add daylilies to that. And so definitely including these. And we are in such good times in gardening. Okay. And here's one reason, and that's iris. Now, I remember my mom and grandmother had iris. They were nice, but they were kind of a small flowered lavender type flower. And, they looked nice. But now, today, the hybridizers have been so busy that I had an opportunity to have some of those older iris. I maybe wished I would have taken some of my mom's older iris, but I'm okay because the iris that I've gotten since are improvements. And I think Mom would think that's okay. Well, anyway, okay. So now the iris that I've gotten, some people have given me some hybrids that they've got, and I've ordered some. And the blossoms on those are just huge. Some of them even have fragrance. I didn't know that iris could be fragrant, but when you shop iris catalogs, they will indicate, good fragrance. And so some of these smell good. And the size of the blossoms and the colors. It's interesting. Iris, the name Iris comes from the goddess of the rainbow, because Iris has probably the widest range of colors of almost any flower. Certain things like marigold, they're all yellows, oranges, creams. There's kind of a whitish one. Okay, but iris, there's black iris, there's orange, there's salmon, there's pink, there's blue, there's red, and there's almost any color in the rainbow, which is a little unique for flowers like that. So many different things. So I am so excited about the newer varieties of iris. So if your experience with iris is some of the older types, not necessarily that you want to get rid of those, but do check out the new iris. And you mentioned the other thing that I really love about iris. Okay, when they're done blooming, and of course, I should mention, too, deadheading is very important on iris. After the flowers fade, then cut down that flower stalk. It'll prevent them from going to seed, which, we don't need the seed unless you're an iris breeder. We don't need the seed, and that saps energy from that iris. And we want the energy to go into the stalk, into the leaves and the root system of it. And
those leaves are they're almost like swords coming up, aren't they? They're pointy. They're wonderful.
They are. Because, that's the point that I was kind of getting at in my ramble there, was that the leaves, even after they're done blooming, the leaves are beautiful. They've got that kind of bluish green.
Yeah.
And some of these new hybrids have even kind of a better, stronger leaf structure, that sword-like leaf, and in combination with the other darker greens, for example, next to a peony, the contrast between the two is really nice. And I probably wish iris bloomed all summer long, but I'm okay with that. Another reason for that is the perennial garden is always changing.
Yeah.
Here, in May and in through June, we got the iris coming on strong, the peonies. Pretty soon they'll be done, but the daylilies won't be far behind, and the true lilies and all those things. So it continually gives me something to just be awestruck with going out into the perennial garden, because it's always changing. And so now it's interesting. we talked with peonies about the traditional planting time for peonies, which is Labor Day in September. Okay. Iris also has a traditional planting time that's a little earlier than that. It's August.
Okay.
If you don't get around to it in August, or if it's really hot, you can delay into the first part of September too. But whenever you look up any iris literature, it says August is the time. Okay, so why would you dig and divide iris? Well, peonies can last in place quite a few years, many years, decades, and may never need dividing unless that center gets kind of dead. Okay, iris need dividing more often than that. But that's okay because you dig, divide, they're going to be with you for 100 years. But after 4 or 5 years, the center of the iris clump, because you see, they tend to widen out their clump. You get more little iris plants coming in and they kind of spread outward. But the center of this big clump tends to die out over time. So every 4 or 5 years in August or early September, you dig and reset the clumps, the good, healthy clumps that are on the outer perimeters. The inside of the clump will be older, woody type things. And, it's interesting. With iris, they don't grow from a bulb. Sometimes when people are working with iris, you see this enlarged thing under soil,
right.
And sometimes it gets nicknamed a bulb. It's actually a rhizome, which is a stem tissue. So it's you'll see iris called iris rhizomes. And the actual roots are fibrous things underneath that fleshy part. So when you reset your, dig, divide, transplant, reset your iris in August, you look for these good, sound, firm rhizomes on the outer perimeter. And it's important that it doesn't get planted too deeply. When you're finished planting an iris rhizome, you should almost be able to see the top of that rhizome, just barely below soil, because the true roots of it are below that. And those roots are what you want down more into the soil. But again, you don't plant that rhizome on the top, but just barely below. If iris are planted too deeply, they'll rot. And so that's the reason for being a little particular with the planting depth.
Where do iris like to be placed? Where's a good spot for iris to grow?
Both iris and peonies, full sun.
Okay.
If they get too much shade, they just won't bloom as fully. So iris are like peonies in that they love the full day sun. If you have a little bit of tweaking that you can do in your yard, the east side, if they could get east morning sunshine and then a little bit of shade in the late afternoon from that hot, intense afternoon sun, that helps the blooms last longer if they're in a little bit of a spot like that.
How about like for water? How much water do they want? Do they want just kind of standard? Do they want a little bit wetter or a little bit drier? Iris can take it a little drier because they've got that fleshy rhizome. It's a little bit prone to rotting. And so in our own yard, when I, 6 years ago when we relocated, moved our house, started kind of over from scratch. Actually, it's been 7 years. But I had to kind of learn in my yard what were the wet spots that stayed a little wetter, what were the drier spots. And one of the perennial gardens that we established that's closer to trees, and of course tree roots soak up a lot of moisture, and I soon found in that area that daylilies weren't growing very well. They liked a little more moist. I found that iris were doing beautifully. So I moved the daylilies out of there to a little garden where it stays a little more moist. The iris that don't seem to mind it dry in areas where tree roots are sapping the moisture, I put the iris more in that area. And so iris do not like standing water. In fact, if you don't have a lot of choices, what you can do is for an iris planting, just raise the soil up a little bit, maybe just 2 to 3 inches around the surroundings, so that when we do get heavy rain, it at least sheds away from your clump of iris. So kind of mounding it around it a little bit.
Oh, another thing that's fun with iris, if you're buying a new pot of iris, well, then you plant that one pot. But when it starts to propagate itself, when you're doing a new planting of iris, instead of planting just one, it helps if you get a little more show if you'll plant like 3, 3 iris. And of course, when you've after you've bought a new beautiful hybrid iris and let it propagate itself for a few years, and 3 or 4 years, you'll be able to separate that and then make a little bigger clump of that. So what I'm getting at is when that beautiful iris blooms, you won't just have one plant of it. You'll have kind of an iris patch of that. So what I've done now, some of these have multiplied. And so now I've got a bigger patch of yellow here and a bigger patch of purple here. And so if they're kind of in clumps of the same color, you get a little more impact from that.
Well, and then again, too, once the flower is spent and gone, you still have those leaves. So you have this wonderful kind of, I can't think of another plant that's got leaves like that we have outdoors in a perennial garden. So it is this kind of nice variety, so that if you have a group of the iris together, you would have this kind of shock of all these kind of different blades of green coming up and upright, and they stay upright. They're really nice like that.
Yeah, they're beautiful. And so even though we talked about August as being the traditional time to dig, divide, plant, but thanks again to the plastic nursery pot, the garden centers have iris on hand, ready for us to buy and plant all season long. So in spring, it's fine. Buy that potted iris that they've got growing and plant it, so it's fine that way. The other thing I should mention is there are different types of iris. The most common one that we think of is called the German iris or bearded iris. The bearded iris is, if you look close at an iris flower, that bearded common name is kind of interesting. A lot of the iris have this kind of little beard coming down on the flower petals, and iris are called the poor man's orchid. When you take a look at an individual iris flower, it's got flower petals coming downward that are called the falls, and then it's got the upright kind of petals also. And so it's just a fascinating flower. Let's see, what else on iris should I mention? Fertilizer is important.
Oh, okay.
Fertilizer important on peonies too, and fertilizer now kind of towards the end of June here, as we're recording this.
So as they're blooming?
Yeah, as they're blooming.
Okay.
And so give them some fertilizer, either granular flower type or the water-soluble Miracle Grow types. The reason for doing this is many of these perennials, peonies is the same way. Many of these perennials, the nutrition that we give them this year helps them become more vigorous, more energy, more flower power for next year. So in many of these perennials, iris and peonies included, the nutrition that we give them this year is an investment in the future. So very important to give them some good fertilizer, but stop the 4th of July. Don't fertilize late in the season.
Should we have, so knowing this going forward next year, how often should we fertilize peonies and iris? The things that bloom really kind of early like that.
Right. Fertilizing in May.
Okay.
At least once in May, or you could do the beginning of May, the end of May, 1st of June, and then end of June would be good. But even if you get one fertilizer in May, one fertilizer in June, that's going to really help. Now, in talking with about iris, I mentioned the German iris, which is the most common one that we think of when we picture an iris flower in our head. There are a couple of other fascinating types too, called the Siberian iris and the Spirea, Spiria, Spirea iris. They have a thinner leaf, not quite as wide as the German bearded iris, a little thinner. They produce a beautiful rounded clump. So when you get a chance, look up Siberian iris and Spirea iris. They'll take a little more moisture. They'll tolerate that. So if you've got a wetter yard, those will do it. The flower form is unique. It's a little more maybe how you picture like an oriental type flower maybe. And The other thing I was going to mention was they don't need dividing as often. They don't need dividing every 3, 4, 5 years. They can stay in place, and they have a little bit taller leaves, darker green, and they cause a very dramatic impact and just from their very structure. And so check those out as well. We've got a few of those in our perennial garden, and they're fun.
Do you ever cut iris in to bring inside as a flower?
We do.
Yeah.
Yep, we do. And they're beautiful, last quite a long time. And
when do you want to cut those? Do you want to cut those like as they're blooming, or when they're fully bloomed, or
kind of when they're just starting to, when the flowers are starting to expand a little bit?
Okay.
With most of the perennials, that seems to be kind of the key, is to get them just as they're starting. Too early and they may not fully expand. But if you wait too long, then they're too close to their end time. So again, let's see. So did we cover everything on iris? So as soon as they're done blooming, you cut them back, cut the flower stalk off.
Right. Yep.
Iris are fascinating to me also, in that there's little miniature iris, and those I did get from my mom. Little miniature iris. They only grow about 4 inches high, and they start blooming early in May. And beautiful purple flowers. I think there are some yellow ones too. But little miniature dwarf iris are wonderful. And then there's kind of an intermediate height. We've got a few of those. They start blooming after the dwarf iris. And then after the intermediate iris, then start the taller iris here in June, usually blooming. So there's a little something for everybody in iris. And that's what makes them so flexible also.
Yeah, and it's just it's so great to have these flowers in early in June. Really kind of kicks off your garden in a way, as far as you're seeing everything else is coming in so nice and full. And then you've got these pops of color around. It's really great to see those.
It really is. And, it's so far this has been quite a good year, good growing season. Early on it was kind of a little too wet. But I'm happy. I'm happy with the way things are turning out so far. And I'm really enjoying seeing our flowers.
I don't mind going out and doing a little watering.
Exactly.
Well, this has been great, Don. If people have questions about peonies or iris or anything, or if they just want to send you photos, what's the best way to reach you?
Send me an email, donald.kinsler, spelled Kinzler, @ndsu.edu. Boy, and I would love to see some photos of your iris and peonies. Yeah, there's so many unique. We have a peony called Bowl of Plenty that is a single one. Instead of all double, fully ruffled, it's a single open blossom. So I'd love to see some of the other peony types and iris types as well. So always feel free to email me. I enjoy hearing from those of you that have emailed in.
All right. Well, that sounds great. Don, we'll see you next week.
Thank you, John, and thanks everyone for listening.